You may start. Thais will start, I guess.
Vai tocar a músicazinha?
There will be music first.
Bom, estamos aqui.
Here we are for our second lecture. Good morning, everyone. I am glad to introduce you to Professor Jørgen Bruhn from the Swedish University. He's the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Department of Film and Literature, researcher on Proust and Bakhtin, also medieval French literature, literature theory, history of romance, and so on. He's published 2 romances, 2 novels. One of them I'm showing right here. And this other one.
Muitos anos. Não, mas eu achei que... Vamos ver. Dá para ver? Não, né? Não, então deixa para lá.
He published these 2 books, Adaptation Studies, New Challenges, New Directions, and the other one, Intermediary Narrative Literature. For many years, focusing on interarts and interactions, published a number of articles in English and also Swedish about these topics, intermediality and narrative literature. This was in 2016, and the other one written in Swedish, Literature Between Media. And now he is concerned about the pathways in studies of intermediality and contemporary eco-criticism, also the Anthropoceno notion. His research group, together with his group, he tries to establish intermediatic eco-criticism as a method, and comparing and reviewing media products against other types of media, and that includes scientific papers, literature publications, or popular publications, literature in general, and arts. Several articles and papers, conferences, book chapters, and reviews of non-academic books. This is all part of his output. We had the pleasure to welcome him to Belo Horizonte some years ago through the Institute for Transdisciplinary Studies. And he also took part in our second colloquium on writing, sound, and image. I'm so very glad to introduce you to Professor Jørgen Bruhn, and now you hear him on his lecture. Any word you would like to put right now, Professor Jørgen, before the video runs?
I would like to say thank you so very much for the introduction, Thais. It's great almost to be back in Belo Horizonte, as close as I get for a while, I'm afraid, but I'm looking forward in particular to the discussion that we're going to have afterwards on these important topics. And it's very much a continuation of the work that I began when I was visiting you already 5 years ago at your center and with all your colleagues and great students. So I'm looking forward to the discussion 1 hour from now. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Jørgen Bruhn. I'm professor of comparative literature at Linnæus University in Sweden, and I'm part of the Linnaeus Center for Intermedial and Multimodal Studies led by Lars Ellestrøm. I will give a lecture on intermedial ecocriticism now, and I should begin by saying perhaps that it feels quite awkward for me to sit alone in a rainy afternoon in Sweden and present a lecture that will, in a sense, be in a context of wonderful Brazilian weather, I suppose, in Belo Horizonte, or seen on screens everywhere, and then we'll discuss this in a few weeks. But I'll try my best to keep my mind on this, even though it's for me a little strange situation. I would like, of course, to thank also the organizers for inviting me. I would have loved to be in Belo Horizonte. I have extremely fond memories of people and places and food and drinks and the museums and everything else in Belo Horizonte. But thank you for inviting me in this form also, and I look forward to talking to you soon. I will share my screen and begin my presentation now. And I have slightly renamed my presentation to Intermedial Ecocriticism, or Revolution Makes the Sunshine. You will find out very shortly why I have called it this rather strange name, perhaps. I'm going to begin with a long quote, a very long quote. It sounds like this: pollution is in fashion today, exactly in the same way as a revolution. It dominates the whole life of society, and it is represented in illusory form in the spectacle. It is a subject of mind-numbing chatter in a plethora of erroneous and mystifying writing and speech, yet it really does have everyone by the throat. It's on display everywhere as ideology, yet it is continually gaining ground as a material development. Two antagonistic tendencies: progression towards the highest form of commodity production and the project of its total negation, equally rich in contradictions within themselves, grow ever stronger in parallel with one another. Here are the two sides whereby a sole historical moment, long awaited and often described in advance in partial and inadequate terms, is made manifest. The moment when it becomes impossible for capitalism to carry on working. These are not my words, it is the words, and they're not written today either. It is the words of situationist philosopher and activist Guy Debord, who wrote an article called La Planète Malade in 1971, but it was only published in 2004 and then also translated into English. And the dramatic opening words seems to speak clearly to our own moment 50 years later now in 2021. The final words of the essay deserves quoting too, if not for anything, then for the détournement and parody, which is so typical for Guy Debord's style. So he says, when it rains, when there are clouds of smog over Paris, let us never forget that it is the government's fault. Alienated industrial production makes the rain. Revolution makes the sunshine. And now you, of course, see the second half of my title here. So it's such a wonderful quote. It's a very limited perspective, you could say, from 1971, shortly after the revolutionary days and time of May 61 in Paris, or perhaps it's not so isolated. From the viewpoint, I would argue, both Scandinavia and South America, in particular Brazil, perhaps in 2021, the situation is not identical, but definitely comparable. We now live in what I would prefer to call a state of emergency. It's an emergency in questions of biodiversity, pollution, and global heating, and it's on a planetary plane. Scientific reports, as well as global news reports add to local and indigenous testimonies from all over the world that witness to an increase of alarming signs of current destruction and future threats. So-called natural weather disasters, ever-growing waste mountains, gigantic plastic islands in the acidified oceans, and planned and non-human extinction at unprecedented paces are getting more and more common around the world. And climate refugee streams around the world create unsustainable political chaos in many places. The threats concern all areas and all aspects of human and non-human life, and radical changes will involve everything from existential and ethical concerns of ethicals, policy decisions, and business strategies. In this situation, there's a risk of being overwhelmed, numbed, and pacified by the sheer enormity of the facts, which is doubly problematic in our current situation that needs individual and collective agency. It needs political mobilization and radical re-evaluations of economic models. It's also important to remember that in the context of universities where we are now, we're doing research and we educate young people who globally express very, very disturbing tendencies to climate anxiety, hopelessness, lack of confidence in the future. And here I have a quote from BBC only a month ago, from September 2021, that says, among other things, the following. It was a huge survey, I think, of like 50,000 young people around the world, which witnessed to some of the following facts. So nearly 60% of young people approached said that they felt very worried or extremely worried. More than 45% of those questioned said feelings about the climate affected their daily lives. 3/4 of them said they thought the future was frightening, and over half say they think humanity is doomed. Two-thirds reported feeling sad, afraid, and anxious. Many felt fear, anger, despair, grief, and shame, as well as hope. I think these numbers are frightening in themselves. I think it's it really speaks to the responsibility, not so much to the young people that we sometimes tend that we want to say to the young, but go out and get this done. They definitely need support, of course, from other generations, in particular because it is our generations who have participated in some of the problems that we face now. So even though anxiety is widespread among many generations, I'm sure, and for many people unescapable, the very basic notions of the state we're in remain utterly complex. The meaning of terms such as climate or environment or emergency are hard to define, and so are some of the epochal definitions that has been suggested, such as the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. These basic terms are under continuous discussion in various academic disciplines and policy fields. What happens when such terms and science constellations are brought together in, for instance, words like climate emergency or environmental emergency? And what happens if we shift the focus from Anthropocene to Capitalocene as the main description of the epoch we're in? And here I would like to add just a notion that we're beginning to develop now at Linnæus University with colleagues. We're a working group developing a kind of educational program that we call Climate Emergency Studies. Climate Emergency Studies. It's meant to be a program for master students from several academic disciplines, where we aim to both provide the students with a knowledge of the state-of-the-art science of what problems do we face, and this will be problems of scientific nature, you could say, focused on climate change. But also, as a second half of this educational program, we aim to offer possibilities for agency for students, because normally, of course, in universities, we tend to train students to receive knowledge and to analyze it and perhaps to describe it in, let's say, articles, reports, essay, which perhaps is a difficult thing to do at the moment, where we risk pacifying students, making students perhaps more anxious than they were, perhaps even giving them a kind of too much anxiousness to really cope with. So that's why we aim to offer possibilities of agency, and in anything from direct action to art exhibitions, to engaging in politics, in engaging in exhibitions, in writing articles for the newspapers, anything that takes them out of the passivity and the anxiety. So we are with a group of people. I'm really looking forward to that. It will begin next year, and we'll see how it goes. A starting point for my research in recent years, and I'm doing this with another group at Linnæus University, and we call this group the Intermedial Ecocriticism group. A starting point for my research in recent years is that the environmental emergency, per definition, is a mediated phenomenon. This means basically that we're confronted with a crisis by way of what has been called eco-media, such as this term is developed in the book Eco-Media Key Issues from 2016. That anthology studies the impact of media on the environment, including energy use and electronic waste. But on the other hand, and particularly close to my project, is the understanding that a broad range of media types represent aspects of the ecological crisis. These media types range from poetry to popular science and political reports, to books, journal articles, fine art, TV programs. All media types may be able to convey the emergency aspects. Not only so-called ordinary people, but also business leaders and national and international policymakers need to navigate in often very confusing media ecologies, consisting of news, fake news, science reports, and all these other media representations of the state that we're in. Common for all these media types is that they more or less truthfully give access to aspects of the world and what we tend to consume, and that we tend to consume such diverging knowledge more or less simultaneously and at the same platforms. That is what we want to investigate, think more about. This means that ordinary citizens, as well as artists and academics from across all disciplines, faces the fact that we necessarily confront the environment in mediated form, in the form of media products. Consequently, a media studies or an intermediality approach is needed to help better understand and perhaps even untangle some of the knots, some of the problems of the ongoing information and representation battles. So we are working at Linnæus University in a working group with the term Intermedial Ecocriticism, where we, and that's what I will talk about in this section, where we will talk about the Capitalocene, and we study the Capitalocene crisis as man-made and media-born. So we see the crisis we're in as both man anthropogenically produced, man-made, but it's also media-born. This is an important phrase to be aware of, I think. And then we analyze and compare representations of the mediated ecological crisis, including, as mentioned already, scientific reports, popular science, web communication, manifest, graphic novels, documentary, feature films, all this that we term then eco-media. And just to say what is then the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene crisis we were in, it is about the fossil economy's destructive extraction projects. It is the dramatic decrease of biodiversity in the oceans and on land. It is the changed phosphorus and nitrate circles as a result of agriculture. It is the depletion of natural resources. It is also, of course, climate change, or rather global heating. So our starting point, and what is perhaps interesting for you at this conference, is some of the basics of media studies. And please excuse me if this is well-known material for you. I'm not quite sure who am I addressing here. But I would say that the basics of intermediality, as I would frame it, is the idea that media are the condition for the thinking and communication of human beings. There's no way of getting around the media when we approach the world, when we communicate with other people, when we try to perceive what is going on around us. So that is also why human beings live in what we could say is media environments. This is a fact, of course, extremely visible now in our digitalized current societies, with digital media all around us, often with perhaps social media, with talking through screens all the time. But it has always been the case that we have communicated by way of, for instance, verbal media, like I'm using now, by writing, by books, by other communicative means. Also, it's part of media studies to consider the way that contemporary, at least Western, but I would suppose most societies around the world have been mediatized, meaning that politics, religion, art, all follow some kind of logics of media forms that go back to some kind of media grounds. And then, of course, a kind of distinctive intermedial idea is that all media are mixed media, which is the old slogan of Mitchell, which I still find is useful to remind myself about from time to time, that all media are mixed media. And then there are different ways of, so to speak, approach the phenomenon of this mixed media nature. It could be complicated in several ways, of course. I would say that there are two ways of approaching this: from the combination aspect, the heteromedial aspect, you could say, or the transformation aspect. So the heteromedial perspective, as we sometimes talk about it, is a synchronic combination in one media product. That would be a poster, it would be a film, it would be a book cover like this book, or any other thing that where we approach several media that integrate, combine in order to conceive some kind of message. And here the main analytical question is, what effects does a mixing or the combination of media and modality aspects have? What kind of messages can be conveyed mixing X and Y? The other perspective then would be the media transformation perspective, where form and content are being transported between different media. Sometimes we say that the typical example of this would be the novel to film adaptation, but another clear example would be all the different ways that scientific material from, let's say, climate science is transformed into newspaper articles, into perhaps novels, into political discussion. These are media transformations too, of course. And here the main analytical questions are, what form and content can be transferred across media borders, and what are the affordances of different media? And of course, here it's important to just remind you that, in a sense, what we're working with in our Intermedial Ecocriticism group is the fact that all representation of the ecological crisis, or the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, can be seen as both media combination and awfully very complex media transformations. And here, let me just, as an example of this, as a very basic, I would like to just go into an article that I've often used in context like this, namely the Waters and his collaborators' quite famous article called "The Anthropocene is functionally and stratigraphically distinct from the Holocene." So it's a scientific article published in Science in the journal Science 2016, and it's a nice example of the ways that all communication, even scientific communication, is per definition mixed. So we have more or less a random article I have chosen, but anyway, where you have a screen dump, like a screenshot like this one, where you see text, a photograph with added inscriptions on it, which is a typically very complex intermedial media product, you could say, this page. The next page offers another view of more or less the same thing of, you know, the combination of colored figures, colored ciphers and writing, graphs, diagram, written text on one and the same page. Sorry, by accident I missed one of the pages. I'll move on here. So this is just to say that this is combination aspect where colors, text, diagrams, and photographs and inscriptions on the photographs gives this kind of mixed impression, the mixed media impression. That would be the combination aspect of this intermediate reading. The other dimension, the transformation dimension, would have to do with the fact that, of course, all scientific articles, in a sense, are quotations of earlier work. They use some of the same forms and arguments from earlier work. And also it is, of course, a kind of way of transforming the raw data of the science into this kind of article. So we could also analyze, if we wanted to go in depth with this, to see this as a media transformation. The other aspect that we want to combine with the intermediate approach is then we call it ecocriticism. It's a very broad term coming from the literary studies, and so one definition would be Glotfelty's 1996 definition that ecocriticism is a study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. You can divide it, and has often been done, into different waves or different tradition, and Lawrence Buell has done that in a famous article a few years ago. I think it's worth mentioning perhaps that in the beginning ecocriticism was a kind of anti-theory movement. It wanted to approach the environment and natural disasters and question directly, so to speak, without all the over-theorized literary theory and philosophy. But that has changed dramatically in later decades. And I mentioned some of the inspirations here, including particularly important, I think, is feminism and ecofeminism, which was early on very important in the development of the field, but also Marxism, post-structuralism, and in recent years, new materialism. One way of understanding it would be by way of some questions and comments made by Ursula Heise in an article some years ago, already in 2006, where she asks, in what ways do highly evolved and self-aware beings relate to nature? What roles do language, literature, and art play in this relation? How have modernization and globalization processes transformed it? Is it possible to return to more ecologically attuned ways of inhabiting nature? And what would be the cultural prerequisites for such a change? Ecocriticism has a triple, and secondly, it's important to say, I think, that ecocriticism has, it walks on three legs, so to speak. It has and I quote again from Ursula Heise, ecocriticism has a triple allegiance to the scientific study of nature. That's the first. The scholarly analysis of cultural representations, and the political struggle for sustainable ways of inhabiting the world. So Ursula Heiss, and I agree with her that it's a kind of this triple loyalty that we would often have if we are interested in eco-criticism. We rely on natural science facts, we study cultural products, and we, in some ways, we see this as a kind of activist academic position. I jumped from the Glotfelty quote from 1996 and then jumped 10 years to Ursula Heiss here. The third quote here is from, I'm very sorry, I forgot the reference here. This is from Greg Garrard, who in 2016, 10 years after Heiss, says simply that eco-criticism is the study of the relationship between the human and the non-human throughout human history and entailing critical analysis of the term human itself. Here you see, and that this is a definition I tend to like quite because it opens up the field of eco-criticism from the field of literature and representations to a more philosophical approach, and also includes many different media. So intermedial eco-criticism, then, the way we try to develop it, contributes to eco-criticism by stating that all ecological questions per definition relate to questions of mediation and representation. Probably most eco-critics would not be directly offended by this, but of course our approach is that we have a much wider spectrum of media that we are interested in. And also as part of that, intermedial eco-criticism demonstrate that the ecological crisis is not only a natural, scientific or technological question, but a problem relating to key questions of humanities. Again, this is not in opposition at all to eco-criticism. They would say the same thing. And what we do is, what we try to do in our group, we do analyses and interpretations of isolated specific media products or comparisons between media products across different media borders. And again, I repeat that these media types would include all imaginable forms: popular science, novels, scientific reports, animation film, newspaper articles, material for children, advertisement, etc., etc. This is perhaps our main argument for widening the field of eco-criticism. And of course, what we then are interested in pursuing is not only analyzing and comparing, but trying to find things to compare more specifically. And in our group, we have compared and discussed in different media products, different motifs. And some of the motifs that we've been particularly interested in would be the question of narrativity. In what ways do we have narrativity in a scientific article, for instance, as opposed to a novel? What narrativity do we have in a documentary film as opposed to a poetry, a piece of poetry? We are very interested, of course, in the ways that different media products represent human agency, how to act upon the crisis that is represented. We have a few of my colleagues are interested in food cultures. How can food cultures now and in the future be represented in different media? And then more specifically, and that's what I'm going to zoom in on now, is a question of truth claims. And in the following, I draw very much on a chapter co-written with Niklas Salmose, Beate Schirmacher, and Emma Thornborg. The chapter is called Truthfulness and Truth Claims as Transmedial Phenomena. And it will occur very shortly, I think the 15th of November, in a textbook that we have worked upon in more than 4 years at Linnæus University. So it's a textbook that is meant to introduce broadly to the field of intermediate studies. It's going to be open access, so everybody can read it everywhere in the world if you have a computer and an internet connection. And we discuss everything in the book, from news to novels to gaming. We discuss, we compare different media. We give examples of how to analyze different phenomena, and we are very hopeful that this will be a widely read book. So Beate Schirmach and I, we edited this book, but it's a collective writing endeavor. Actually, I think we were 15, 18 people writing, crisscrossing these 19 different chapters. So I very soon you'll be able to take a look at it, and I hope you will like it. But now the question of truth claims and truthfulness. At the Linnaeus Center for Intermedial and Multimodal Studies, we're discussing truthfulness and truth claims in the most general sense, and we see it as a reliable or truthful representation of the world around us. Then the concept of truth claims refers to the reasons a media product provides why we should kind of rely on it. So we have the specific truth claims, and we have the general effect of producing truthfulness. Together, these two concepts enables us to describe how we perceive a particular media product to be truthful and what kind of knowledge of the world we can derive from it. We're interested in everything from news to novels, from poetry, scientific articles that has this kind of truthfulness to it. Instead of speaking of post-truth or alternative facts, instead of telling facts from fictions, we're interested in the idea that all media products have elements of truth claims to it. So describing and analyzing and comparing truthfulness as a transmedial phenomenon both broadens the field of research and at the same time makes it more specific. And also we would go out from the idea that media product gives us access to what we do not know from our own direct experience. That is kind of the starting point perhaps of all media. In order to gain knowledge from media products, we have to trust the sources in some sense of the word. When we read books, journals, or newspapers, watch television news, or Google a question, we trust the testimony of the experience of others. According to media philosopher John Durham Peters, media, and I quote here, media is a means by which experience is applied to others who lack the original. It deserves repeating. Media is, I quote, a means by which experience is applied to others who lack the original. When we elicit knowledge from media products, we, for instance, trust the people involved in its production and the institutions they are part of. Every qualified medium is framed by a set of gatekeeping acts through which a media product gains credibility. A printed novel in a bookshop confirms that the author, the editors at the publishing house, and the owners of the bookshop all consider the story in the novel relevant and important enough to be published and sold. In a comparable way, every film affirms a collective belief in the project, ranging from that of the film directors, cinematographers, editors, and producers, and going all the way to the distributors. And when we go to science, then a scientific article confirms the relevant evaluation and critique of the findings of the study produced by the authors. It has been peer-reviewed, it has been criticized by editors, and then finally published. Implicitly, each and every media product we claim contains a warranty or a guarantee that specific acts have been carried out. When we respond to the truth claims of a media product, we rely on knowledge about the qualifying aspects of context and convention, and we try to confirm what kinds of acts are involved in creating this particular media product. It is this notion of truth claim that I will pursue in the following. So I have tried to sketch some of the questions we're interested in our Intermedial Ecocriticism group, focusing a little bit more in the end on the question of truthfulness. And now I want to move on to 3 examples that very briefly will exemplify some of the work we're trying to do. And I will begin by saying a few words about a graphic novel called Saison Brune, or Climate Changed. It appeared originally in 2012. So Saison Brune, I would say, is an interesting example of, in a sense, a relatively direct conveyance of what we could also call perhaps objective truth claims from science, but it is framed in an autobiographical context that makes it subjectivized but reliable because it is subjectivized. So the very opening of this rich, big, I think it's like 300 pages graphic novel, is a very kind of meta-reflexive consideration of how to begin a work of art. And we see him considering his early memories of going to the cinema, reading books. He quotes several famous openings of literary works. And we slowly understand that the issue here is that he's starting a new work with a very complex theme, namely climate change. And you could say that what he does, and I go to the next slide here, is that he incorporates, in this graphic novel, life and science is incorporated. So constantly in this graphic novel, and I think what makes it quite efficient is the way that the graphic novel says that the graphic novel and Philippe Squazzone, in his autobiographical way, filters the scientific material through himself. So he has his own doubts concerning the validity of some of the science being made. He has doubts concerning how to change his own life. He has doubts concerning how to represent this in a graphic novel, how to act upon this. So it is these constant interminglings between different ways of representing the world. And here he, in a sense, represents himself reading some of this scientific material. And we see this visualized in this beautiful slide of himself reading material with a graph, then showing some of the famous hockey graphs of the great acceleration. What I find useful and interesting in this way of representing climate science is the way that it is constantly framed in questions of doubt and reflection. And also he faces existential doubts and existential fears even, and that is part of this explanation of the climate change issue we're in. So we are seeing him working all the time, anchoring personally these scientific ideas, while at the other time, sometimes we have pretty fierce and long and very complex arguments concerning the science of this. But all the time, the science is put in a context of personal evaluation. Sorry. I'm messing up a little bit the sequence here. And then finally, we see that that what he ends up doing is actually closing the circle. He's trying to close the circle of beginning and ending the book in a very metafictional sense of the word. And what I found rewarding in his approach to this is the way that heavy science and heavy existential subjective issues are mixed in the same medium of the graphic novel. hard science is visualized and exemplified. There's lots of numbers and lots of historical developments, but all the time in the mix of a personal narration also, so that we could say that the truthfulness of this piece of graphic novel art is actually the subjectivization of the scientific arts. It is art seen through this subject, this Philip Guazzoni himself. We could say it is this subjectivization that makes it trustworthy. And that's one position, that's one way to do this. Another way is, and here I go to one of the most important sources actually of our knowledge concerning at least climate change, namely the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who published a very disturbing report this late summer, and a 3,000-page report where I've only read and looked a little closer at what is called the summary for policymakers. That means basically ordinary people who wants to be able to read. It's about 40 pages. And what we see there is, of course, in the same way of the scientific article that I mentioned early on, it could be analyzed both as a heteromedial combination of images and text and so on, but also as a transformation. This is a scientific report in the tradition of scientific reports, doing all the things that scientific reports are doing. And also, of course, it's a very specific way of transforming specific data into this report as a media transformation. So we have, for instance, here the visualization of scientific data. It's a temporal lines here being shown by way of graphics. This is very basic. And we have a visualization of spatiality here. I don't think, it took me a little while actually to recognize this as very, very schematized version of the entire globe and these kind of symbols. And of course, this is a question of trying to convey very, very, very complex scientific novel in the most direct and clear scientific way. So here we have a kind of visualization of data sets in a very palpable way. It's almost a little bit, you could perhaps say, I would perhaps childish, but also very convincing in its way of making things, complex matters, visible. And even here we have, you could say, an image of some of the possible futures, some of the possible futures lying ahead of us, graphically visualized here in different possible futures. I've been very interested in some of these. These are all data computer generated futurings, you could say. I've been interested also early on in comparing, let's say, a novel with the scientific predictions of the future. It turns out, of course, that novels and science have very many things in common in the modelizations of science. But I will not go into that here. And then finally, we have lots, of course, of text in the report also. And what struck me when I was reading in the report was some of the formulations of text like this. And I actually, it's not very reader friendly here. Not all of this even short report is so reader friendly. But what struck me was that, of course, that this report wants to make it make a very, very truthful. It's crucial for such a report to be truthful, and it works by way of different truth claims. It works by different data. It works also by a very, very specific and detailed way of writing. And of course, coming from literature as I do, we're used to linguistic uncertainties. You could say that's what literature perhaps is all about. Literature precision, but also extreme uncertainties. And I was struck by the way that the report sometimes says something like this, and I read here: from the likely range of total human-caused global surface temperature increase from 1850 to with the best estimate of 1.07 degrees. It is likely this, and it is even very likely, it says further down, and it is extremely likely. And I was first a bit confused, and I thought, how do they elaborate with these linguistics terms? And then I found an older document in the IPCC website, which is a fantastic source of information, where you can find the following. This is a report from 2010, where all IPCC writers are encouraged to follow these particular way of scaling the uncertainties. So you could say that virtually certain means 99 to 100% probability. Very likely means 90 to 100% probability. And what I'm interested in here is the in a sense obvious, but also for a literary scholar, amazing fact that probabilities in percent can be translated directly into terms, and these terms should be systematically employed in the writing. And then it was also from an intermediate, that is in a sense an intermedial point in itself. It's a transformation from ciphers to letters. And also then I was interested in another figure I saw, namely this figure that goes from the lighter to the darkest corner here, going from low agreement and limited evidence to high agreement and robust evidence, which is a kind of way of visualizing in a frame here the way that certainty should be approached. Sorry, just a moment. So with this, I'm at my third and final example, namely Jenny Offill's book Weather, which will be my most purely literary example here. And this novel that came out in 2020 is, to begin with, a realist novel about a woman working at a library in New York City, her family relations, and her work for a podcast and a lecturer. It is not directly, and that's what interests me also, not directly a climate novel, except for the fact perhaps that weather would kind of directly lead you in that direction. But when reading the story, and also when I've read about some of her intentions behind the book, it is clearly a climate fiction novel, but in a very special way. And we could ask what kind of truthfulness is actually in here. So this novel depicts everyday life and very small, not to say minuscule, events and dramas. But nevertheless, and without that, the reader can actually pinpoint the actual, and the reader cannot really actually pinpoint the transformation where the small family begins investigating extremely dramatic ways of changing their life. So the title Weather seems to signal both something very everyday and common for all, but also the fact that today weather has, and this is something many commentators have said, today weather is not something banal. Weather is always subject to kind of discussion, to possible conflict. It can be now weather is kind of an explosive question. It is also worth mentioning then that Jenny Offill has made extensive research in climatology and global warming studies, which is quite elegantly woven into the novel. And once again, as a reader, you seem to vaguely feel the weight of all the facts as it is being accumulated step by step in the novel. But seldom, very seldom, is science directly referred to. More often, it's just reflections of science in use in conversation in small and hard to understand details. Also, I should say this is an extremely funny novel. You laugh all the time reading while also feeling a bit insecure about what this is all about. From an intermediate point of view and following how I would normally analyze a novel, and I could refer to some of perhaps my book, Intermediality and Narrative Literature from 2016 employs this model also. Normally, my first step would be to focus upon the representation of medialities, as so often they are too numerous to mention or to list up. But already after about 15, 18 pages, the following media types have been mentioned and briefly remarked upon. And I'll just say this quickly for you. A podcast is mentioned, an educational 3D game is mentioned, supermarket flyers are mentioned, a magazine, bills to be paid, movies, telephone calls, letters. There's a person coding, or her husband coding. There's signs and elevators, out of order, of course. There's newsletters, there's lectures. There's all these things around her that she has to navigate in. And this list may hint to the fact that the protagonist here is both confused, scared, and partly apathetic. She seems to be partly moved around in a confusing and scary universe of information and campaigns, disinformation, and then also the very, very, for her, shocking event that Donald Trump is elected president in the United States. With her husband, she becomes more and more interested in so-called prepper techniques. That means ways of escaping society and survive in some kind of non-social environments if the great disaster happens. And here I think the disaster that could happen is both the kind of the fear of a fascist overtaking of society, but also which interests us here, the ecological catastrophe, or perhaps both. That's also why the book reproduces one of several iconic but strangely discomforting fact boxes. She has several fact boxes in her book. And this one is with some kind of questions and answers. And here the question is, what is the difference between a disaster and an emergency? And the answer here, a disaster is a sudden event that causes great damage or loss. An emergency is a situation in which normal operations cannot continue and immediate action is required so as to prevent a disaster. In other words, our protagonists probably live in the near panic situation of emergency. And that's why she, with her husband, begins to do architectural drawings of a house in the woods, how to plant batteries and food supplies, and where exactly to place the house so that a little family should possibly invest in a property far, far away from New York City. And I quote here, Ben and I made a list of requirements for our doomstead. That's a kind of term for these new prepper houses. Ben and I made a list of requirements for our doomstead: arable land, a water source, access to a train line, high on a hill. Are we high on a hill for flood or defense? Both. I'll build a moat, he said, then went on the internet to learn how to do it. And this is a typical kind of comical situation, because I don't think we have any hopes that her husband, who is a former PhD student now turned into a coder, will ever be able to build a moat in the woods somewhere in the States. But this is the sign of their desperation, that they have to rely on the media form of the internet to find information about this. In terms of genre, this novel would probably not be directly labeled climate fiction novel, however you choose to find that subgenre of the contemporary novel. But I certainly choose to read it that way. I would argue that this can indeed be read as sci-fi literature, not of course in the same way that some of the classic examples in the genre, including the dystopian works of Norwegian Maja Lunde, who's had an international reputations of her work, or American Kim Stanley Robinson's techno-utopian sci-fi cli-fi, or the very dark visions that dominates a number of the most popular young adult dystopian works. Instead, this is a novel that deals with the slow, anxious feeling that perhaps we're living in a state of emergency without being sure if we do. It's a novel that both have a strong narrative pointing to this, but in intermedial term, this point is made too by way of this accumulation of small but distinctive hints and signs symbolized in the ever-present parts of the eco-media, which are everywhere around, in particular the protagonist. Now, in what way does this novel work with truth claims or with truthfulness? So I said that in our intermediate group, we confront the classic discussion of how to define fiction versus non-fiction by stating that this is not a strict demarcation line. Instead, all communication has aspects of fiction or narrativity or non-fictional aspects to it. And therefore, we want to describe instead in which ways this particular media product employs specific devices, that is, aspects of truth claims, that creates this paradoxical impression of truthfulness in a novel. From a traditional literary point of view, the novel, of course, follows the rules of realism. This means that the novel represents a recognizable world with recognizable rules that follows the laws of nature. So that's basically realism, you could say. Even the human beings here act and think in patterns and ways that we recognize as if they could have been part of the world outside fiction. What the intermedial approach may add to this, and this is an early sketch of a work I want to pursue more, in this case is a focus on the ubiquitous presence of media products and media types with which I began this list of different media surrounding her, confusing her, and also guiding her. I would argue that the novel demonstrates that the protagonist lives in an environment of media, in a media environment, you could almost say, and that a feeling of desperation and anxiety slowly but step by step is created by way of these media instances. Therefore, I would argue that this novel, even though it works with this gentle satire, is nevertheless a fictional but truthful representation of how people, without ever getting in direct touch with hard science, so to speak, for instance, the IPCC report that I just mentioned, they experience the stressful situation we're in. This novel does not express hopes of futures or ways to act directly. It's not a manual for acting. It is a description of how many people feel the current state of emergency without knowing if they are in a state of emergency. And with this, I want to end my presentation here. I try to start out giving a kind of image of how I see a common broad planetary situation, then focusing on how perhaps intermedial studies may enrich the basic ideas of ecocriticism in the work we're doing at Linnæus University. And then I gave three quite short and perhaps too superficial exemplifications of how we can talk about truth claims and truthfulness in three very diverse media products, namely a graphic novel by Philippe Squazzoni called Saison Brune, or Climate Changed, as it is translated into in English, the IPCC report, where I was interested in some of the ways that it is, of course, like a scientific, like a normal scientific article, it employs different media aspects, but also the way that it, so to speak, translates data into ciphers and ciphers into text. And then finally, a kind of more obscure, but still, I think, very truthful depiction of how, for many people, it feels to live in the planetary situation we're in now, at least at some highly developed societies, perhaps mostly in the north, namely Jenny Offill's novel, Weather. So I'm gonna end this talk here. I thank you so much for your attention. I look very much forward, much more forward than this lecture talking to myself. I look forward to talking with you about this in a few weeks. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, professor.
Many thanks, Professor Jørgen.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. It was such a long talk, terribly long talk, I thought. But let's see if we can get some discussion here. I would like actually now when I saw two things here, I wanted to correct.
Vou te falar, fazer as primeiras perguntas.
Yes. I would like to say just two small things. I'd like to say that, of course, at one point I noticed that I was talking about the May 1961 almost revolution in Paris. It's, of course, May 1968, not 61. That was a mistake. And also, in the very end, I noticed that I'm saying a bit, like a bit casual, that in the northern, highly developed countries, this is how it feels to be engaged with the climate emergency. I think it's quite unhelpful to talk about the highly developed and undeveloped. I should say more, perhaps it's a kind of, the overdeveloped countries, as somebody is talking about in the north, for instance, instead of highly developed.
Sem problema, professor.
No problem, Professor Bruhn. I thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. Really good, really highly interesting. And it took none of our patience to listen. We were very excited to hear. But I have my own question. I was really thrilled with your proposal for the intermedial ecocriticism. I'd like you to describe those 4 steps that you take in your analysis. How do they develop, these 4 steps?
I'm a little bit doubtful to go into too much detail with these steps. These are kind of mathematical ideas concerning how to develop a kind of stabilized way of analyzing things. But very briefly, you could say that it's about describing and analyzing the particular media products by themselves by way of intermedial terminology. And we've worked with this already, as you know, in our group, and I've worked with this both in literature and in film and in other media types. And it's about trying to describe the media product as in as specific way as possible, and then going on to some kind of comparison between the different media products, following some kind of question. And you could say that what I relatively briefly demonstrated in this presentation was a question of truth claims or truthfulness as one of the things that can be compared across media types, possibly. And then apart from that, also, I'm very well aware that intermedial description and intermedial analysis and comparison is not enough to understand really the nature and the intricacies. Also, there has to be some kind of framing around this, some kind of context around it. But that is roughly speaking how I imagine such an analytical model. It is an attempt to try to to find a way to make comparable our analysis of very, very, as I say, diverse media products. We ask ourselves in the group and whether, if it is possible to find a way to compare such strange bedfellows as the IPCC report on the one hand, scientific, hardcore nature's scientific data collection and interpretations and so on, with a novel. Does it make sense? And then, of course, also then comparing it, for instance, in this case, to this graphic novel. It's very much a work in progress, I should say, and we're not absolutely sure how far it is possible to go in this direction. How much can we actually, in a meaningful way, compare these things? But that's our idea, at least.
Muito obrigada. Eu tenho aqui uma pergunta.
Many thanks. I have a question from Professor André Mendes. He says this: in watching your presentation, I couldn't fail to recall the 80s, when we had the sensation that we were on the verge of an atomic conflict. Young people at that time suffered a lot with the prospect of a total annihilation of the humankind. There was a high concern about building bunkers that would allow us to survive the impending so-felt atomic war. Do you feel the same thing about the possible parallels between the two periods?
Yes, so this is a very good question, a very difficult question, I think, and I'm sure many people think about this all the time. So one thing we should perhaps one way to go in this is to say that, to say that there's always been risk, and look how it went all right anyway, right? To minimize it. And when we think about this, I think we should be very careful, because actually it has turned out now, there's been many examples, proved examples, that we were actually very close to an atomic disaster that would have destroyed everything. So even though we didn't have the catastrophe, actually our fears, as we all remember, was very real and very realistic, I think. But I do think the sentiments, the effects that this produces can be definitely compared, I think. There's one, and of course, if one would look historically at this, then one would be able to go further and further back and find numerous ideas about apocalypses, going from religious to more basic scientific concerning, let's say, overpopulation and that kind of questions, which came early on in the 20th century. And it's impossible to say what we will say about this in 20 years, of course. I think what is special about this situation is that there's a highly united and unusually united science that is backing this. That's really a very terrifying thing, because I know I'm talking into the context of Brazil also, where you have your very own difficult political questions to deal with. And one of these political questions is, of course, a denial of climate science. But it's very important, I think, to keep your head cool in this situation. And every time that you hear that some scientist is actually doubting this, then if you pursue this and go into this, you will find out that this is probably either a very old man, it's always men almost denying this, I'm afraid, and it's often also scientists which are not specialists in climate science. So you would find lots of elderly men around the world who are very sure that this is just some kind of hoax, in the same way that Bolsonaro and Trump would put this. But there's no scientific backing behind this. That's very important. And in a sense, it has. I have actually grown more confident in science when thinking about this during the last 5 years. And then in that sense, it's a kind of positive thing that science is actually so backed up on this. But at the same time, this is also extra terrifying, because there's really no scientists saying that there's an easy way out of the situation we're in. So I do think it's a comparable situation to the 80s, and the fears and anxieties are comparable, but nevertheless, it's a kind of different scientific background concerning the two risks, I believe. Thank you for the question.
Muito obrigada. Agora eu
Thank
tenho
you so much. We have a question from Paulino Cerqueira Jr. He asks this: in your opinion, mass appropriation of information technology and communication technologies would contribute to fictitious types of news?
I'm not absolutely sure if I have understood correctly the question, but I think it's a question about mass media, perhaps social media, and the question of fake news, fabricated, fictitious news is and that is definitely what is happening. We all know that, and that's part of.
Eu acredito que sim. Ele escreveu isso.
That's what I believe it is. Yes, it should be fake news instead of fictitious.
Yeah, but I mean, it's in a saying, it's synonyms also, fictitious news or fake news. So that's definitely a question that needs to be faced and needs to be. I think I'm not an expert on this. I have very good colleagues who study this intensely at the moment at our center at Linnæus University, Beate Schirmacher, among others, and Christopher Holt. And my own opinion is this is probably that the big tech giants needs to take responsibility for what they are publishing. They probably need to be seen not only as a kind of neutral platform, but actually as a kind of publishers. And they're beginning to do this, as you know. Trump was, sent away from some of the larger platforms. And I think I heard, if I'm not mistaken, that even, I'm afraid, the Brazilian president was banned from, at least temporarily, because of some statements he made. This is a very difficult way, of course, to go, because who is to decide this? But I mean, I think it should be possible and very important to find some ways of defining reliable truth claims. If somebody is in a very powerful situation, is saying that taking the vaccine amounts to getting a higher risk of AIDS, then I think it's a very irresponsible thing to publish, I must say.
Muito obrigada. Temos aqui agora uma pergunta da professora Eliana.
Thank you. So now a question from Professor Lourenço Reis. In your book, Disjuncture and Differences in Global Cultural Economy, published back in 1990, the author discusses fluxes that characterize contemporary world, including mediatic landscapes and ideological landscapes that lead to the dissemination of ideas and images, contributing to creating imaginary worlds based on images and narratives. Would these be useful concepts to discuss ecological discussions and intermediate issues?
Yes. Again, I'm a little. It's probably a little difficult with this media situation we're in at the moment, where we have a written message coming in to be translated, and then I have to try to understand, because I'm not absolutely sure that I understand the question. It sounded like a kind of an early discussion of what perhaps I would term a kind of intermedial or media studies questions that definitely could perhaps be combined in some way. I'm afraid I misunderstood a little bit the question. I'm very sorry about that.
Ela me pergunta o seguinte, que nesse livro,
in this book, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy by Abadurai, the author discusses features of contemporary world between the mediascapes and ideological landscapes or ideoscapes, which would be responsible for the dissemination of a repertoire of images that would contribute to the creation of imaginary world. Those are images only, narratives only. So in our opinion, these concepts would be useful for our discussion about media products in their relationship to ecology.
Yes, sorry, now I understand perfectly clear what is being said. Thank you. Yes, I do think so, and I know a little bit, not too much, but I know the work of Abadurai and his kind of anthropological global visions, and of course some of the things that I'm talking about here, and sometimes you could say perhaps that sometimes it is a limitation perhaps of intermedial studies, that we tend to stay focused on specific texts or media products without perhaps being able really to grasp the larger trends and larger, broader contexts, which is of course what is being referred to with a term like mediascapes and these globalized media patterns, because that's where many of these images and fake news and true news, so to speak, or news are being distributed to us. It would I'm very curious about trying to combine the more textually based and individual media product based analysis of intermedial studies with more elaborate, wider ranging theoretical concepts. So this would include questions, for instance, of thinking about media as infrastructure, as a kind of, the really what is getting all the information and knowledge and fake news and images and narratives about our futures, is that all this is being distributed in media infrastructures. And I would very much, it is a kind of a theoretical dream of mine at some point to try to combine these different strands of media studies. So thank you very much for the question. Yes.
Tem uma pergunta aqui.
There is another question here by Ana Murari. If you think, do you think that artificial intelligence in literary reading done by a virtual assistant would be, no, she didn't understand it, and she'll read it again. Can we think of artificial intelligence in literary reading done by a virtual assistant based on ecocriticism? It sounds confusing, and it is.
And I understand perfectly well what is meant here, and I think also I know the questionnaire here, so that's very nice. Yes, I do think so. I do think that a kind of big data approach, or artificial reading, or distant reading, sometimes it is called, an approach to this. It is both a possibility when used in the right way when it comes to literary studies, and I would say even to intermedial studies. What it would make possible is, of course, to make some of the all too encompassing work of the individual scholar, or even a group of scholars who are never able to manage to see everything or read everything. In that case, it would be extremely helpful to find AI ways of diving into this vast universe of different media types and media products. The thing is, of course, that it's very demanding to set up an analytical scheme for doing this in a meaningful way, because as far as I know, I'm not a specialist at all in this, but as far as I know, AI approaches into like this are very helpful to get some kind of first grasp of what is out there, what can be found. Let's say we are looking through all Facebook feeds yesterday concerning environmental emergency. That would be great to know how many is using this term, or in last year's novel publications in the US, for instance, it would be great to know. But then afterwards, after you have found some kind of data on this, that data has to be managed in several ways, which are difficult, but it is it would be very interesting to get what it would enable us to do as researchers in any field, basically, is to get larger views of what we are normally when we're normally constrained as individuals. So that might be a kind of future project also. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Uma outra pergunta do Eduardo Rodrigues.
Another question by Eduardo Rodrigues Siqueira. How do you think veganism and related studies have contributed to intermedial ecocriticism?
Did you say vegan studies?
Yes, that's right. Yes, vegans and veganism, yeah, studies. They call it ethical veganism. Vegan,
okay.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, yes. And how does it relate to intermedial or to eco-critical studies?
Yes, that's right, yeah. How does it contribute to the intermediate eco-criticism studies?
Okay, yeah. So I would consider that to be one of the, so to speak, the themes that one could investigate, perhaps. One could investigate, for instance, a representation of vegan persons in different media products, from from newspaper articles to novels to documentary films, and so that would be one entrance where we could try to compare across media types how vegan persons represent. That would be a very simple, perhaps even a banal way. On a deeper level, of course, vegan studies, along with animal studies, critical animal studies, these kind of critical trends in contemporary cultural studies, I imagine play quite a large role in the broad field of eco-criticism and environmental humanities. It's part of the, perhaps an even broad, I'm not sure which is really the broader trend here, but something that I'm been a little interested in is the question of multi-species studies. That is, studies that are in many different ways interested in the way that human beings, human animals, you could say, have deep interrelations with non-human animals and even other aspects of
Bom, tem uma pergunta da professora
I
Márcia.
now have a question from Professor Marcia Bex. She thanks you for sharing your recent research with us. And when you deal with truthfulness, I got interested, and I think of literature, those texts that are in between autobiographies and fictional books. Many writes like Kezoba, Lou Breton, they combine this type of narratives and pictures, so to say, that are present in the book. How do you understand this media representation when it comes to representations of truthfulness?
That's a very good question. And it's a very rich question, and it's something that has been researched very deeply. I think there's a huge kind of research literature on the fields of fictionality and autobiography and autofiction and related terms. I'm afraid I have to answer a little bit on the defense here. Yeah, I would probably have to say that autobiography and autofiction in all its different contracts that are being made is perhaps an interesting phenomenon in the way that it seems to point exactly to the thing I wanted to say also in my lecture, namely that it's probably not very helpful to distinguish, at least in the arts, for instance, to distinguish very clearly between fiction and non-fiction, or even related aspects like narrativity or non-narrativity, or even broader terms like artistic, non-artistic, or aesthetic, non-artistic. I think what I learned from intermedial studies and all the comparisons that we make across different media types, what I learned from that, I think, is that fictionality or fictivity, whatever you choose to call it, or narrativity, is distributed actually in all media types, I would say, almost all media types at least, but to a larger or smaller degree. And of course, what is interesting and very, very difficult and fascinating with then autobiographies is that's really where it's put put on the edge, I guess you could say. So I don't have a very good answer concerning that specific genre, I would say, but I would say perhaps that what is being negotiated, what is being exemplified in this kind of genre is actually present across many other genres where we normally would not think about it. So I would definitely, as I mentioned briefly, also find construction of truth claims in a scientific report, where of course it's very important that we can rely on it. But I would also find aspects of narrativity in a scientific report, and even aspects of fictionality, I would say. Because I mean, every time, and this is something I was very interested in a year or two, 3 ago, but I was extremely interested in the fact that that science, okay, a little background on this. Climate science is a hugely complicated field of research because it takes, and going back to the question of artificial intelligence and big data, it's a hugely complicated phenomenon. It's well known that, weather reports are very unreliable, even on a short term, right? And then imagine that you want to make predictions for climate for the entire planet for years in advance. How to do that? That's only possible to do with hyper strong computer programs, simply. And one of the things that these computer science-based research can do is to make predictions or make data simulations, as we call it. That's actually predictions out in the future where we say, let's say we put out as much carbon dioxide as now. In the future, we'll have this amount of degrees, we'll have this amount of water, etc., etc. That's a scientific data simulation, which demands extreme amounts of data power, computer power, and of course scientists to do this. But that is, of course, and then the IPCC, for instance, would make different scenarios, sketching out different futures for us. That is, of course, very close to what a novelist would do. A novelist writing a science fiction novel, but even a kind of more novel just taking place next year, is actually also working with some basic data points, you could say. He would work with characters, he would work with a recognizable surrounding, and then he starts writing this in order to make kind of prediction of what could happen. So in this sense, I mean, science and literature are to a certain extent parallel, even though, of course, to get back to my point concerning science and fake news and reliability, we don't want to trust fictional novels concerning the hard science facts. We want to use literature, art, cinema in order to try to understand better, both perhaps why we got here in this tough situation, and also how to perhaps psychologically and existentially and philosophically think about the possible futures that we're facing. And so that's probably what the sci-fi literature and the cli-fi literature is very much about. There's been a very nice, sorry, now I'm just rambling on here, but there's been a very nice concept by Anne Kaplan called pre-trauma, the pre-traumatic stress disorder. You know, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that's the kind of affective, traumatic effect you can have if you've been subjected to something very violent, and you've been in war, you've been a refugee, you've been raped, for that matter. Terrible things that becomes a trauma for you, that makes it very hard for you to cope with reality for good reasons. And Kaplan, who is a film scholar, she has this idea that much of the cli-fi and some of this dystopic sci-fi, that's actually a pre-traumatic stress disorder. It's a traumatic disorder where we try to prep ourselves psychologically for what may possibly come in the future. And that's of course what literature and the arts can do. They can make some kind of simulations for us to live in for a shorter period of time, where we can kind of orientate ourselves. Yeah. Sorry, that was a very long answer to, I think it was a very good question, but I just went a little bit along here.
Problema. Temos aqui a pergunta da
Now we have a question by Professor Ana Luisa Girardi. She thanks you for your excellent lecture and asks, how do you believe that the different uses of tones like a black through white and the absence of other tones, how can it contribute to the creation of a meaning in that book, Saison Brune, that you mentioned?
Eu acho que naquele
I think that as you presented the dark and the light, you know, chiaro, escuro effects in the book.
Here's a chiaro, yeah, that's a very good question. So perhaps the first question and answer would be that there's probably the very basic black and white is, I would guess, a question of economics. Simply to publish a huge book like this, it's 400 pages, I think. Yes, 450 pages, a graphic novel, would perhaps be too expensive in colorful illustrations. So, but perhaps also, of course, the Squarcioni, I think, is a very good graphic novelist in the sense that he is both able to write a good and thoughtful autobiographical story, of course, as I said, coming back to the former question, but also he's a very good, he draws these things in a quite sophisticated manner, where the colors of gray and deep darkness are clearly expressive and some symbolic. It's clearly so that he's working consciously with these color tones and color schemes. I would like to reread the book and think about it one more time with your question in mind, but so to repeat again, perhaps what I said in the lecture is that I like this book quite a lot, and I worked with it and I taught it with students also a few times, because I find it to be a very rewarding way of trying to depict hard science in a way that is reflected all the time through a subjectivity. All the science that we have in this book is actually, channeled through this person, Philippe Squarcioni. I read this clearly autobiographical, and everything from the writing style and right choice of words and the choice of images, the choice of political debates, and also the choice of colors and of grays and white and black is very thoughtfully arranged. So if I could take a look at this in the light of your question, I'm sure I would be able to answer a little better that there's probably a kind of systematicity to this, an artistic systematicity.
Bom, agora temos uma pergunta do Augusto Correia Cipriani.
Now we have a question of Augusto Correia Cipriani. He thanks you for your lecture again, and he asks, I'd like to know your opinion about the very notion of mediation of sources of intermediate relationships, like scientific papers. Do they convey a truth that is within themselves, or do they convey a truthfulness that is born from the interactivity that it entails?
Yes, what do I think about that? I'm not quite sure what I think it's probably a very good question, so good that it's a little bit beyond my reach, perhaps. I will try to say two things. First, one thing, I think also, you saw the schedule, so to speak, of 90 to 100% likeliness and color scheme. You remember in the IPCC kind of writing style. What sometimes we humanists, we think that the natural scientists are naive, that they believe in very naive truth concepts, but I think most natural scientists, they don't. They're very well aware that the data that they collect and the data that they interpret and then they publish in scientific papers or at scientific conferences like this are the best possible truth at the moment, but there's a very high risk or possibility that it will be surmounted by even better results in the future. That's probably how even I would consider it. I suppose it's kind of mainstream truth idea here. What what I would then add to this is what we are interested in, and we're not the only ones being interested in this. Some of the critical science and technology studies traditions, some of it in Bruno Latour's work, and others are very interested in all the different mediations of data. Because the fact is, of course, that very, very early on, each and every data is already a kind of mediation into some kind of media product. Every single laboratory result, every single signal or data that is being picked up in nature by some kind of, either by eyesight by a scientist, or more often by a camera or other technical devices. So there are, in a sense, no raw data. All data are already entering into mediating systems of science or human senses, and then being translated numerous times into first discussions among scientists. Then you cut up some data, you put something in, you develop further on that, and then you write about this, you discuss this, and so on. All these are, of course, a huge network, a rhizomatic network of mediations, actually. And of course, this I think it was a very beautiful question you had, because it seems to point to the fact that whether the kind of mediation idea of science gives some kind of relativity to scientific work and natural scientific work, for instance. And I would say that not necessarily. And this is a discussion that has been really, really tough and still going on, the kind of science wars going on. And Latour in particular has been violently attacked, in particular for his earlier text, perhaps. But I seem to see that Latour has also perhaps changed position somewhat, and is now highly relying on the scientific notion of, let's say, climate change. And I was just last week, I was actually traveling for the first time in Europe, taking the train down to Karlsruhe and to Paris and other cities. And we saw the great Bruno Latour exhibition in Germany, Karlsruhe, called Critical Zones. There's a great website on this, ZKM, the Zentrum für Kunst und Medien in Karlsruhe, and they got a great exhibition also online, and there's a really good exhibition catalog where Latour and others are talking about the concept of critical zones. Critical zones, that's actually a kind of scientific entity, you could say, a way of understanding limited parts of the world through a multi-scientific approach, in order to get as rich as possible an understanding of a certain spatial space. And this exhibition in Karlsruhe was really, really inspiring, I thought, because it actually begins with a large, exhibition hall, only focusing on a limited space in France, I think in the southwestern France, if I'm not mistaken, where all sorts of different scientific approaches are mixed into knowing as much as possible about this critical zone. And I'm very much thinking about this as some kind of approach that even humanities and science, hard sciences could perhaps approach together, thinking about smaller scientific zones where, in a polyphonic way, you could say that different approaches agree to investigate different aspects in order to reach a higher level. Not only, the 1+1 of science plus humanities, but actually a 1+1 becomes, and social sciences, actually the 1+1 becomes 3, possibly in this, in such an approach. I don't see it might be because I'm a little bit naive in these very, very complex questions, but I don't see a problem between investigating the mediations of data and of science, and the kind of belief that science is at the moment at the best is at the moment the best possible knowledge that we have. But this is highly contested area we're in, of course.
Bom, muito obrigada. Tem aqui uma pergunta.
So many thanks. I have another question from Josué Vasconcelos.
Yes and no. Yes and no, because I understand, of course, exactly what you mean, and that's what when you're talking about the guts and it should relate to our guts and so on. That's of course what is done in much of the great popular science that we're seeing, both online and in popular books about very difficult subjects. And that's a kind of, you could say, that's a kind of genre in itself, perhaps popular science information or publishing, public science simply. And one of the great examples of this is, of course, going back in literary eco-criticism is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson from 1963. This wonderful literary book, which is, she was a biologist, and she noticed that the springs became silent in the US because there was so much DDT, poisonous in the field, so that the birds died. And actually this book, because it was so violently going to the guts of the reader, it actually made DDT understood as a kind of poison. So it was kind of banished in large parts of the US because of her book. So that was a success, of course. And that's how popular science should work. It is very clear that, let's take the IPCC report. The scientists, and this is thousands of scientists all over the world who have checked and double-checked and triple-checked and 10th checked everything in this work. They are very, very cautious to put personal statements in this, because they're very much fear that they will be doubted because of that. And there has been some so-called scandals about the IPCC writers, where some of their old emails have been picked up, and it supposedly should say that the IPCC is not doing scientific work, which was a hoax. But what they're very careful not to put that in the text. Also, they want to try to make clear cut that this is what we can say with reliability. And then politicians and policymakers, citizens, business leaders has to decide on that. So that's why I'm saying yes and no. I totally agree, of course, that science must come out to the rest of us who can't read scientific reports. But probably it is wise to keep some kind of borders between science and popular science by amongst fictionalization in a hard sense of the word and more objective prose, for instance.
Bom, nós temos mais 5 minutos, então eu vou.
We still are left with 5 more minutes to go. So I'll make the question by Tassiana Andrade. She said, it's just a comment, not exactly a question, but I believe that intermediality in the examples shown, like graphic known and the novel, play an important role in helping understand data that for many would be inaccessible, like scientific data anyway. With these new medias, the information becomes more palpable, less tedious, less boring, and it approaches space, the various senses, and so on. So, and again, thank you for your excellent lecture, Professor Bruhn. And a final question, perhaps. We have 3 more minutes to go, but Andrea just asked this. Do you think that censorship in social media is a valid means to prevent lies to disseminate through the internet. Who would do that control? The scientists, perhaps?
Yes, yes, that's why I said there was a very dangerous road to enter. But it seems to me that we have learned, perhaps in the recent years, that no censorship is also highly, highly dangerous. And but of course, one would have to make some kind of that's what they're doing actually. The Facebook advisory board and so on. What they're doing is actually trying to find out ways of what is allowed to publish in concerning political and scientific statements and what are not. What is considered to be politics and what is considered to be science, for instance. That is a philosophical question, but that it could also be a publisher's question. As I said, when some of the more exaggerated things, to say the least, of both Bolsonaro or Trump or other leaders or non-leaders, perhaps it should be kind of gone through some kind of evaluation before it just hits everybody. Also, I mean, not everybody are trained in say climate science or epidemiology, of course. So that's why I thought it's said that it's a kind of irresponsible, perhaps, not to do it. But it's not an easy question.
Bom, nosso tempo está terminado, professor.
So our time is up, Professor Bruhn. I would like to thank you so much for your lecture, for your questions to the your answers to the excellent questions raised. And it's been a pleasure to be mediating this lecture. And I thank you again, and we'll be seeing each other soon, hopefully.
Yes. I hope so also, yes. Thank you so much to everybody who listened and was patient. And thank you, Thijs, for your nice, yes, exactly, mediation. That was perfect. Thanks a lot, everybody.